Am I the villain for telling my father that he failed my half-sister and me? Before I was born, before my parents even met, my father was happily married to a woman and had 2 children. One of them is my half-sister. One day, my half-sister, her mother, and my half-brother were in an accident while driving to the mother's parents' house. My half-sister was the only survivor. She was 8 years old. My half-brother was 11, and their mother was in her 30s. My father lost his wife and son, and my half-sister lost her mother and brother. She suffered a lot from their deaths and lived with intense survivor's guilt. I've heard from cousins that the whole family knew she was struggling badly and that many relatives talked to my father, telling him she needed help. Instead, he met my mother 2 years later and married her after a year of dating. I was born almost a year later. I was given my half-brother's name, the female variant of it. That carries a lot of weight. My half-sister hates me and my mother. She also hates my father, but in a different way. She sees us as replacements for her mother and brother. I have some memories of her living with us, being super distant and cold. But one memory that has always stuck with me was when I was 5 years old, and I told her that I was named after our brother. She went crazy and told me I was named after her brother, that he was only her brother, not mine, and that he was her only brother. She told me she wanted nothing to do with the replacements my father found for her mother and brother, and that if I ever said he was my brother again, she would cut my tongue out. The memory was a little traumatic because, aside from the threat, she was clearly hysterical and devastated. My young mind didn't fully register it, but looking back, I can still see her face. My father and my half-sister fought a lot, even as she grew older. They never lost contact completely, but they didn't see each other much either. He wanted her to visit and acknowledge me and my mother, and she refused. She said he had replaced them, that she could never forgive him for it, and that we could all go to hell for ruining her life and her family and thinking we could replace them. My father never protected me from that, neither did my mother, and I have a lot of issues with my mother, things she should never have ignored, but for the sake of this story, I'll focus mostly on my father. But one example of how my mother messed up is that my sister broke down crying at the wedding, accusing my father of replacing her mother and accusing my mother of being happy to take her place. My father's relatives thought my half-sister seemed heartbroken, but they went on with the wedding and acted as if she had just made them uncomfortable. And I don't know how anyone could get married after that. I know I'm only 17, but I think that's really messed up. Anyway, whenever my half-sister was around, there were fights. She and my father never got along. We weren't invited to her wedding last year, and they fought about it. Then my father found out she was pregnant and hiding it from him, which caused more fights. In the years leading up to all of this, they would argue, and he would tell her she had to stop acting as if he had done something wrong by remarrying. Then there was a fight about how naming me after our half-brother was disrespectful to him and his mother. You could feel the contempt she had for my mother and me. On Christmas, I spent some time at my grandparents' house, and she showed up to drop off some gifts. I asked if I could ask her a couple of questions, and she said no, but stopped and waited. So I asked her if she really felt like my mother, and I had replaced her mother and brother, and if she could ever see me differently. She said she felt that way to her core, even more so after having a child of her own, and that no, she would never want anything to do with me. She said she had one brother, only one, and that I could never replace him, no matter how hard my father tried to make it so. All I could see was someone who was still in a lot of pain. My father complained that she didn't come to Christmas with our extended family, and that she didn't introduce her child to everyone. He was upset when he found out that my grandparents had met the baby, as well as some of my uncles and aunts. He was furious with her for not bringing the baby to meet him, my mother, and me. He said that the baby had grandparents and an aunt who would love to meet them, and that she was just being stubborn. One of the times he brought it up, he asked me why I never seemed to care. He said that I had a niece or nephew I had never met and might never meet, and I didn't seem to really care. He said our family was being rejected. I told my father that I knew I would never meet her children. I knew she would never be part of our family in that way. I told him that she had said over and over how much she hated us, how she saw my mother and me as replacements for her mother and brother, and how she blamed him for making it that way. I told him that he failed her when he didn't help her the way her family thought he should have, and that he failed her when he got married even after her breakdown at the wedding. I told him that she was a little girl who lost her mother and brother and survived when they didn't, and that was horrible. I told him that he should have helped her more before bringing someone else into this, and that he pushed her away by moving on before she had even gotten past the first stage of raw grief. And I told him that he failed me by bringing me into this and then doing nothing to protect me from the fact that my half-sister hated me. But after that conversation, I started thinking about something I had never dared to consider before. What would it be like to try to reach out to my half-sister, not seeking her affection, not expecting her forgiveness, but simply getting to know her beyond the shadow of our family? Maybe the pain wouldn't disappear, but what if there was something more there? What if there was a way, however small, to break the cycle? Days later, I found myself standing in front of her door, my heart pounding and a paralyzing fear settling in my chest. I didn't know what I would say or how she would react, but something inside me pushed me to take that step. I took a deep breath, raised my hand, and knocked firmly, waiting for a response that could change my life forever. I stood in front of the door for a few seconds longer than I'd like to admit. My hand was still trembling slightly after knocking on the wood, and for a moment, I wished no one would answer. Maybe it would be easier if I just walked away. But just as I was about to turn around, the door opened. My half-sister appeared before me, her expression shifting from surprise to annoyance. Her hair was tied up in a messy bun, and her eyes looked tired. She probably wasn't expecting visitors, least of all me. "What are you doing here?" Her tone was dry, defensive. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the weight in my chest. I hadn't prepared a speech. I didn't know exactly what to say. I only had questions, doubts that had haunted me for years. "I just wanted to talk," I finally said. She scoffed and crossed her arms. "About what? About how you ruined my life? About how your mother and you replaced mine and my brother? About how my father pretended they never existed?" I felt a knot in my stomach. I knew this wouldn't be easy, but hearing her anger in person was different from imagining it. Still, I stood my ground. "No," I replied calmly. "I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about you, about what you felt, about what you still feel." For a moment, I saw something in her eyes, something that wasn't just hatred. It was pain, the same pain I had felt in every word she spoke, in every rejection, in every look of contempt. But as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, and her usual hostility returned. "I don't want to talk to you," she said firmly. "I don't want to see you. I don't want you coming here thinking you can fix anything. My family died. Period. There's nothing to say." It hurt, more than I wanted to admit, but I wasn't going to give up so easily. "That's okay," I murmured. "I don't have to stay. I just wanted to try. I wanted to understand you better, and if you ever want to talk, I'll be here." I took a step back, waiting for a response that never came. She only stared at me, her jaw clenched and her gaze cold. Finally, the door closed in my face. I stood there for a moment, feeling a mix of defeat and hope. Because even though she had rejected me, even though she still hated me, I had seen something in her face. Something that told me not everything was lost. Maybe one day the door would open for me again. Days passed, and I tried to move on with my life. But the conversation with my half-sister kept circling in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about her expression, about her pain, and about my own determination to try to heal something that seemed irreparable. My parents didn't know I had visited her. It didn't even occur to me to tell them. I knew my father would react with a mix of frustration and hope, insisting that she was part of our family and should come to gatherings. My mother would probably tell me it was a waste of time, but this wasn't for them. It was for me, and in a way for her too. One day, without thinking too much about it, I wrote a letter. It wasn't long, but it was honest. I didn't try to justify anything or make her feel bad. I just wrote what I felt, what I had felt for years. I placed it in an envelope and went to her house. This time, I didn't knock on the door. I just left it in her mailbox and walked away. Days passed without a response. I told myself she had probably torn it up without reading it, that she would never open it. But then, a week later, I found an envelope in my school locker. No sender, but I recognized her handwriting instantly. My hands trembled as I opened it. The letter was short. No apologies, no kind words. Just a simple phrase written in black ink. "Stop trying to fix what's broken." I read those words over and over again. I didn't know how to feel. Part of me wanted to cry. Part of me wanted to laugh, because even though they were harsh, even though they were a rejection, they also meant something. She had read my letter, and that, however small, was a step forward. Days passed without another response after receiving that letter. The phrase echoed in my mind like a persistent whisper. Stop trying to fix what's broken. Still, I couldn't help but wonder if she truly believed everything was broken beyond repair, or if, deep down, there was a part of her that wished someone would try to pick up the pieces. Winter moved forward, and with it, a growing restlessness settled in me. My attempts to move on kept colliding with my half-sister's shadow, with the certainty that her pain was still there, just like mine. I couldn't help but think about her child. What were they like? Who did they resemble more? Did they have our father's eyes? Would I ever meet them? Then, on an ordinary afternoon, when I least expected it, I received a message. An unknown number, no name, but I knew it was her. Why do you keep insisting? I stared at the screen, feeling my breath hitch. I had the chance to reply, but what could I say that wouldn't push her further away? I took a deep breath and typed, because I don't want this to end like this. The response took time to arrive, minutes that felt like eternity. And then her message appeared. You have no idea what you're talking about. You don't know what it's like to live with this. It hurt to read it, but she was right. I didn't know exactly how she felt, but I wanted to try. I wanted to understand. So I replied, no, I don't, but I want to listen. The message was read, but there was no response. Over the following days, I found myself checking my phone more than I wanted to admit. Would she reply? Had she closed that door forever? Days turned into weeks, and although there were no more messages, something had changed. The idea of letting it go, of pretending nothing had happened, was no longer an option for me. I had taken a step I couldn't undo, and then, one day, when I least expected it, I saw her again. It was at the supermarket, a coincidence that took my breath away. She was there, pushing a shopping cart, her child in a baby carrier strapped to her chest. She looked different, tired, but with a strange sense of calm in her expression. She didn't see me at first. I, however, froze, unable to decide whether to approach or not. When she finally lifted her gaze and noticed me, her expression hardened, but there was no anger in her eyes, just a deep exhaustion, as if she was tired of being at war all the time. Hi, I said, my voice weaker than I wanted it to be. She stared at me for an eternal second. Then she glanced at her child and, without a word, kept walking. I didn't expect much more, but at that moment, I understood something. The hatred she had for me wasn't as simple as I had thought. It wasn't just anger. It was something much deeper. And if I wanted any chance at healing the wounds, I couldn't give up now. I decided to keep writing to her. Not letters or messages asking for her acceptance, but small notes with things I thought about, with simple questions, with no expectations for a response. Sometimes I talked about myself, about how I felt. Other times, I simply left scattered words, like a thread stretched into the air. She didn't always reply, but when she did, her words were cold, brief. Still, she remained there, and that meant something. One night, while scrolling through my old messages, I found a new one. I'll be at the park tomorrow with my child. Don't expect much. My heart pounded. Was this an invitation or a warning not to come near? It didn't matter. I would be there. When I arrived at the park, she was already sitting on a bench, her child asleep in her arms. For a moment, I just observed her, wondering what was running through her mind. Then, with a deep breath, I walked over and sat beside her. Thank you for letting me come, I said softly. She didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were fixed on nothing, as if she was gathering the right words. It's not for you, she finally said. It's for him. I don't want him to grow up with hate without knowing why. I nodded. It was a small step, but one that allowed me to keep moving forward. And in that moment, I knew this story wasn't over yet. The park was quiet that afternoon. The leaves of the trees swayed gently with the wind, and the murmurs of children playing on the grass filled the air with a sense of normalcy that contrasted with the whirlwind inside me. Sitting on the bench, my half-sister kept her arms crossed, silently watching her son sleep peacefully in her lap. I don't know why you keep coming, she said suddenly without looking at me. There was no hostility in her voice, but there was a deep fatigue, as if she had spent her entire life carrying a weight she couldn't put down. Because I want to understand you, I replied honestly. and because I want us to understand each other, even if just a little." She let out a sigh, and for the first time in a long while, she turned her head to look at me directly. Her dark eyes were filled with restrained emotions, but they weren't as cold as before. She didn't hate me any less, but maybe, just maybe, she was willing to listen. "You don't understand anything," she murmured. "It's not just that my mother and my brother died. It's not just that my father replaced them so quickly. It's that I had to watch him build a new life as if the old one had never existed. And you," she paused, her gaze hardening. "You have his name, the same name. Do you know what that is for me?" I didn't answer immediately. I knew that anything I said could do more harm than good. But in the end, I said the only thing I could. "I know, and I'm sorry for what that means to you, but it wasn't my choice. I didn't ask to be his replacement, and I never wanted to hurt you." She remained silent, as if processing my words. I realized that for the first time, she wasn't rejecting me outright. "And what do you want me to do with that?" she asked after a moment. "Forgive you? Pretend we're happy, close sisters? That's never going to happen." I shook my head. "I don't want you to pretend everything is fine. I just want you to know that if you ever need someone, if you ever want to talk, I'll be here. Not because I'm your sister, but because we've both been victims of what happened." She clenched her jaw and looked away. She didn't respond, but she also didn't push me away. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but almost peaceful, as if for the first time there was something between us beyond resentment, something small, fragile, but real. Minutes later, her child began to stir, waking up with small sounds. My half-sister gently rocked him and, with a sigh, stood up from the bench. "I don't know if it'll ever change my mind," she said, adjusting the baby's blanket. "But at least I listened to you. That's all I can give you for now." It wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was something. And for me, it was enough. I nodded and watched her walk away, her child in her arms, as the cool breeze tousled her hair. I stayed sitting there a little longer, watching the park, feeling like, for the first time in a long while, I could breathe a little more freely. I knew that the path to peace wasn't easy and that maybe it would never fully come. But in that moment, I knew I had done the right thing, and that, at least,